Okay, chaps and folks, and ladies and gentlemen,
Let's get a little quiet on the steps.
do pay attention. Okay. So, thank you for coming tonight. So I'm standing in for Tom, so you can see the resemblance. Anyway, Tom and Susan are in Florida, lapping up the sun, hopefully not being rained upon or suffering typhoons or other financial or climatic disasters. But anyway, so tonight this is meeting number 488. As you may know, we put on a meeting every week, hopefully on a different topic. But tonight we have David O'Neill, who is a computer programmer and a mechanical engineer. And so, since he's an engineer, it's appropriate that the title of the topic is On the Science of the Priests. And so, anyway, so the format of the meeting is the presenter is given about an hour to speak. Normally you can go under that or slightly over that. Then we follow that up with questions and remarks by the audience that last about 5 minutes each. And then, your questions to the speaker. And then, if you have something to say yourself, you're given 5 minutes each to speak. So, and then lastly, the presenter can wrap up the meeting, rebutting the rebuttals and giving his closing remarks. So, without further ado, we welcome David to the podium on the topic on the science of the priest. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm nervous. I've never done this. I've given a speech in front of one other audience before. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. My intention tonight is to share with you guys some of the forgotten science behind religion and some of the forgotten religion behind science. It opens up an aspect of history that we've overlooked and turned our backs to for over 1,000 years. The reason I got into this is because when I was a kid, my mom ran away with my sisters and me to a fundamentalist Catholic cult. It took us up to Idaho, and like other religions, they said that God exemplified perfect love. But when my dad came over and tried to get us back, all of a sudden they started hating on him and started calling him the son of Satan. And I even believed him for a bit because it was my mom and grandma saying it. But anyway, Dad got us back, and as I slowly outgrew those earlier beliefs, I was left with a lot of questions, and I wanted to understand religion better and understand the mind of God. And I got the impression that the priests really didn't understand it, so I became an engineer and studied science and engineering instead, and kind of forgot about my quest to understand the mind of God. And about 4 years after college, I found a book in the library that started me on a new course, and it said that some ancient myths were intimately connected to events in the night sky long ago. And the authors didn't know what they were talking about. The aspect of history they were trying to come to terms with has been forgotten for so long that it's been completely forgotten. It may have been known about 2,000 years ago, but even the signs of that are iffy. But what I ended up discovering was the thoughts that gave rise to our current definition of God and what our priests were thinking 3,000 years ago. Let's see if I can figure out how to master this thing. Just to give you a background, O'Neill versus Schuckart, it went to the courts, or the divorce went through the courts, and there was a $1 million verdict against the church at one point. So just to give you another thing of how crazy it was. When I found the book, they were saying that there were events 6,000 years ago that our ancestors were watching that were encoded in myths. And out of the book, there was only a couple good clues in it. And one of those clues was the biblical Samson story was somehow connected to the planet Mars. And they said that because Samson has the same mythical characteristics as Martian heroes from other cultures. He's impetuous, brave, lustful, and fiercely strong. And they didn't reveal what it was about, but those clues were enough to make me curious. And about 6 months later, I came across another clue that said they were somehow tied into the events in the night, that Mars was Samson, and it was connected to a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction series. And a conjunction is when two planets come together in the night sky. And that made me start looking at Jupiter and Saturn coming together with Mars, and it brought me to this event, which I it worked today, where Mars passes directly between Jupiter and Saturn in 2271 BC. And I made the connection when I saw that the first time. My mind was blown. It revealed, if my thought was, if Jupiter and Saturn were considered to be pillars, this might explain the end of the Samson story, where Samson pushed apart two pillars and brought a house down, killing 3,000 Philistines. Well, after that, I spent a couple years working I was still doing engineering work at the same time, and I was kept trying to figure out the rest of the story. And over the course of a couple years, I've got about 80% of the astronomy figured out, what type of events would explain the events in the Bible, in this biblical Samson story. And I presented it to a teacher in SMU, and he said that it was too early. 2271 BC was way too early for the Israelites. And since it's an Israelite story, it has to be connected to them in some fashion. So since then, over the past 25 years, since I started looking at this, I finally figured it out, what was going on. And for you, I'll give it a lot easier for you than it was for me, because that 25 years is a long time. Basically, to give the long view is, how many are familiar with the Babylonians and Mesopotamians here? Everybody? Okay. Well, if you're not familiar with them, they were probably one of our earliest priests that really seriously started investigating the night skies. And they started investigating about 3,500 BC. And one of the things that threw me off in the book is they said everything was 6,000 years ago, and they were just off. They were doing New Age stuff in the book. The first thing that we know is the first thing that drew their thoughts to the night skies was the cycle of the moon. What is it with this thing? If you watch the moon night by night, of course, it takes 29 and a half days roughly for the moon cycle. We know that in ancient that the Babylonians were able to calculate the rough time of the next moon visibility, the new moon, about 2000 BC, because the king of Sugar left us a note saying that I learned how to calculate the moon, the first appearance of the moon. So that means that they had been already looking at the moon cycle for quite a while. The other thing that one of the other things that probably first drew their attention to the planets themselves was Jupiter and Venus. Let's see if I have to do this every time. After sunset, Jupiter and Venus, as a lot of you know, are the first two planets to appear, and they'll often appear in the night sky while it's still blue out. In fact, you can often see them right immediately after sunset, and if you really know what you're doing, you can see them during the day sometimes. So that drew our observers to try to figure out what was going on, and of course they deified it with the planets being gods of war and gods of love, which still resonates down to today. After watching the skies, though, they were trying to figure out cycles and periods. And one of the slowest cycles they saw, after probably it took them a couple hundred years to figure it out, was Jupiter and Saturn. Those two planets come together every 20 years, and this is just showing them coming together in the sky and their retrograde motions and how they come together. After watching it a lot longer, they realized that Jupiter and Saturn have the slowest longest cycle of all the planets, of all the cyclical actions in the night sky. It takes every 20 years, Jupiter and Saturn come together, and they form a rough triangle in the skies. It started with Jupiter and Saturn are over here, and each first round of the sun is a year in here, and it takes about a minute to do this, so we can all relax. But now they came together there, and then in another 20 years they'll come together up at the top, and so it forms a rough triangle. And that 60 is why the 60 is found on our watches, because when they realized that, they connected 60 to Anu's number, and Anu is the god of the sky at that time. So it wasn't 60 was connected to Jupiter and Saturn, it was more like 60 is a presentation by the god of the sky. So it's more like they're watching a film or watching a video back in them days. When I started getting into it, I found that the 60 cycle actually explains one of the astronomic terms that was used back then. Is anybody familiar with the term Nibiru? Mm-hmm. Okay, for those that aren't familiar, Nibiru, if you go online, it is a term that you'll see where people think that there's a 10th or 13th planet. They're not very scientific, all these people writing the Nibiru stuff, but they say it's a planet coming back, and it should be here in the next 100 years or so, and it's going to destroy us or bring about a new age. But if you go back to the documents, Nibiru was connected to the planet Jupiter in some way. And Nibiru was said to be the ferryman, which is where his name comes from. And the reason, an explanation for his ferryman motion actually comes about if you go back to 1776, 1774, 1773 BC, at the vernal equinox, which is the first day of spring in our terms. I think that was their most important day. It was their New Year's Eve day back then. And at that point, Jupiter and Saturn come together, and Venus is coming up below it. And one of the terms that's prominent in the documentation, well, I can stop this. One of the terms that's prominent in the documentation is this square right here is the Pegasus square. So we know for a fact that Nibiru is connected to the New Year's, that it was somehow connected to the Pegasus Square, and it was connected with Jupiter. And this event in 1773, 1774 explains more aspects of the Nibiru puzzle than anything else that's been proposed so far. With that, 60 was starting to become more connected to Jupiter instead of Anu. And we know for a fact that the Babylonians continued studying, and back in like 1650 BC, we know that they studied the Venus risings and settings for a period of 21 years, watching when the Venus first appeared above the horizon after sunset or before sunrise. To give you an idea of, so you understand what I'm going to be showing in the next couple minutes, our modern astronomy has broken sunset into 3 periods, which is civil dusk and dawn, nautical dusk and dawn, and astronomical dusk and dawn. And they occur when the sun is within 6 degrees below the horizon, 12 degrees below the horizon, and 18 degrees below the horizon. For the upcoming events, I chose to do snapshots at 12 degrees below the horizon just so that everything's on the same terms, so you can see it more easily. That brings us to the Samson story itself, because it started out in 1416 BC. Now, is there anybody here who's not familiar with the Samson story? Okay, so just a brief overview. It's in 4 chapters in the Bible, Judges 13, 14, 15, and 16. Judges 13 was his birth. Judges 14, he kills a lion single-handedly. Judges 15, he slaughters 1,000 men using the jawbone of an ass. And Judges 16 was the puzzles with Delilah. One of the things that scholars have been questioning is, why is he named Samson? The name Samson means roughly man of the sun or little son. And that's not a Judaic name like Isaac and the other names were. About 1000 BC, we know for a fact that they started turning to Jehovah, and they became Jehovic names at that point. Samson, the name itself, predates the Jehovic influence. So Samson, the name itself points to the fact that the Samson story originated in Canaanite times. Our scholars and archaeologists have revealed that the Israelites are an extension of the Canaanites. The biblical stories have not been verified where Moses and Aaron overcame the Israelites from outside. The archaeology shows the Israelites actually kind of turning against themselves, turning against their kings. And the rubble shows that it's internal infighting rather than external fighting that explains the archaeology. And that happened between about 1400 to 1200 BC. The first sign we have of Israelite, the word Israel, comes from about 1200 BC. With that, when I figured out the astronomy, I found out that the Samson story originated as a story to record the actions of Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus at those 60-year points on the vernal or at the 60-year points. The Judges chapter 14 was I don't know exactly when Judges chapter 13 came into existence. It probably came into existence about 1000 BC or 900 BC. But Judges 14, or Judges 15, Judges 14, excuse me, came into existence simply to record what Mars was doing in conjunction with Jupiter, Saturn, and Venus in 1416 BC. And at that point, Mars, night by night, is coming up on the horizon. And you'll notice Leo, the celestial lion, is coming up. Jupiter and Saturn are getting ready to conjunct over here. Now I swept over to the western horizon so you could see them setting on the western horizon. Jupiter and Saturn fall. Mars passes through Leo. The story was simply written to record the fact that Samson, Mars, was killing Leo on the 60-year point. It was just a way of capturing that 60-year aspect. It was pretty easy. Then after that part in the story, Judges 14 actually has them come back and get honey from the beehive that was said to be growing in the lion. 2 years later, due to Mars' cyclical action in the skies, Mars came back, and there's Mars in Cancer. This is a place called the Beehive since antiquity. And all that they were recording with that part of this tale was that Mars was getting close to it. They pictured Mars getting honey from that little beehive cluster just to create the story from, to record what was going on at those times. From that, there's, let's see, I think, those are just three, the beehive killing the lion. You can say that the lion falling to the horizon was one killing, and Mars passing through it was tearing it apart. Viewed in those terms, that's three of the astronomic parallels that are in the story. In the book, I've documented everything in a book, and I show a total of 11 correlations between Samson and this biblical tale. The Canaanites did not stop watching those events back then. In 1416 BC was 60 years after the 1416 BC. The next Jupiter-Saturn 60-year conjunction took place, and all the Judges 15 documented was the events at that time. This, I was just showing you, this I'm just showing how this looks like on the ecliptic. If you were to disregard the Earth and just view us as a point and just watch the sun's path in the sky, that's how the events would have occurred on the ecliptic, so you can see it that way. In 1356 BC, the jawbone was a conjunction in the Hyades. That was a Babylonian term for the jawbone. And Mars, just show that again. Jupiter and Saturn just conjuncted, and now Mars gets close to the jawbone, and they pictured Mars reaching out and grabbing that jawbone and using that to kill or bring about the end of an age. All told, in Judges 16, there are 7 correlations to the biblical tale. After Judges 15 occurred, there was a turmoil in Canaan. The Egyptians had been the rulers of Canaan until those times, and in about 1350, 1320 420 BC, Akhenaten was the ruler of Egypt, and Akhenaten tried to bring sun rule to the Egyptians, and when he died, there was turmoil in Canaan over religious influence, and evidently that turmoil reached out to Canaan itself, and because the way the creators created the tale changed at that point. Judges 16 was documented the events on the subsequent Jupiter-Saturn 60-year conjunctions until 980 BC. In 980 BC, some of you, the United Monarchy started to come into existence. Is anybody not familiar with the United Monarchy? Okay. When Canaan lost, or when Canaan was in turmoil, it was small goat herders types of culture in that area. And about 1000 BC, King David started uniting the area of Canaan into a monarchy where the whole of Canaan started having political power as a monarchy rather than as a disjointed chieftains. And we know that occurred about 1000 BC. If you want to read about that, the best scholarly book is William Deaver's book called Beyond the Text, or Beyond the Text, I believe it's called. And he's a master archaeologist. It's a tome, but it tells all of the archaeology that's been discovered and how the political and personal lives of the people is reflected in the archaeology of those times. Another aspect that happened around those times was that all of Canaan and all of the area went through what's called the Late Bronze Age collapse. The Greeks started coming over into Canaan and the surrounding area, and everything in the whole area collapsed. They don't understand all the reasons for it. They think some of it's politics, some of it's maybe earthquake, drought, famine, but the trade routes dried up and everybody went back to living an agrarian life around 1200 BC. But the priests managed to keep watching the skies and figured out the Samson story at that point. And each of the riddles of Delilah, as I said, records a characteristic of each of the following subsequent 60-year periods. And I didn't go put together slides for all them, but the last one that they showed was Jupiter and Saturn in 980 BC, is when Samson pushed apart the pillars. During the conjunction itself, Mars wasn't visible because it was on the other side of the night sky. And then a year later, Mars came right between Jupiter and Saturn. Everything retrograded at the same time, collapsed, and then that's how the pushing of the pillars came into existence. All told, there's 15 correlations.
So that was a major Mars retrograde.
Right. That's not very often. It happens more often than you think, but it's not something that happens on every 60 years by a long shot. So it's very relatively rare. That Beyond the Text that I told you about goes into the fact that the United Monarchy came into existence between about 1000 to 900 BC. The Samson story has to have been compiled into its current form at that point. I don't understand all of it myself, but evidently the king said to the priests, what is going on in the skies? Another book that's worth reading, or at least delving into, is Mark Smith, A History of God. And he shows that the Canaanites, the Israelites, started dropping polytheism around 1000 BC when they started turning toward Yahweh. Nobody has said why they've turned toward Yahweh, but this shows that we know that earlier polytheism, they were thinking that the planets were individual gods. The stories that they created about Samson did not make sense. Judges 16 was formed into a riddle because they didn't understand what was going on. They didn't understand that they were planets like we do today. But they still thought of the gods as great. But they started turning away from the thought that all the gods might have had different powers, and they just turned towards the idea that one god is more powerful than the rest of them. And Mark Smith goes into the transition, but not the reason for it. The Samson story reveals the reason for it. The priests were thinking, these don't make sense. We know night by night the planets are cyclical. Mars comes back every 2 years. Venus does this, comes up on the western sunset horizon, then the sunrise horizon, sunset. It never goes sunset, sunset, sunset. Then it's the moon always goes 29 days, 29 and a half days. These things were not the great beings that they were taught. So they created the Samson story to try to explain it, and then they started turning away from the idea and started turning towards Yahwehism. Let's see, what else can I... I don't know what else to say, but that's basically all. My intention was to show you what our priests were thinking, why they started turning towards the God that we now know of as God, the thoughts that were going on 3,000 years ago, how it was recorded in astronomy. I can add that our astronomical language that we have did not start to come into being until about 400, until around 400 BC, when they started to realize, when the Babylonians broke the ecliptic up into a group of, I believe it was 12. That was when the 12 constellations came into existence at that point, and they started thinking in mathematical terms. Before then, they didn't have the terms to actually record the story in any other way. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
I'll return the microphone. Just into
Are you of the opinion that everything in the Bible has astronomical corollaries?
No.
Okay, why not?
I believe a lot of the biblical texts, I think the Bible is the most important text that the Israelites had. It was their most important stories. And they were trying to come to terms with morals and politics and everything that they could come to terms with. And most of the stories they chose resonated with the audience for various reasons. I believe that most of the stories are probably at least 50% based in reality, maybe. But most of the stories were the stories that resonated with the Canaanites or the Israelites. For instance, I've heard some people say that the Jesus story was astronomical in origin. And one of the chapters of the book, I pretty much destroy that myth by showing some of what was going on in the astronomical thoughts at that time and how for instance, some of the people that have claimed the Jesus story is astronomical in origin base their claims upon saying that Jupiter and Saturn were conjuncting, and part part of the claims are claiming that, part of the claims indicate that our priests would have had to have been interpolating the position of the sun 2,000 years ago. But you go back and look at other things going on then, and they were not interpolating the position of the sun, so that it's not true.
Okay, and what came first, the astronomical events or the story? And at what point did the story get written down? I mean, if the astronomical stuff came first, at what point did the story came down? And how did it come to be so detailed a story?
The only thing that from what I can tell from the story that we have, the original 1416 BC events were created as after the 1416 BC events were witnessed, some story documenting that was created. And it was probably a tale that was told in a very local cultic center in Canaan. Remember, at this time, one of the documents shows that Canaan was each city was controlled by a prince, is one of the things that was, I do the quotation in my book to show what it was, but it indicates that each city had its own political structure. It wasn't, the cities weren't unified. So it indicates to me that the priesthood that created this, which makes most sense to be Beth Shemesh, because Beth Shemesh, it was actually a little town, and Beth Shemesh means house of the sun, which means they were watching the sun worshipers, and Samson being man of the sun indicates that that would be a good fit. And we also know that there was a ring, not a ring, but one of the things you press, I believe, a seal, about that big around, I think it was, that has been dated to about 1200 BC, that appears to be a man killing a lion. So our scholars have associated that with Samson killing a lion, thinking that that's the first artifact that confirms the story. So anyway, getting back to the answer to the question, it was witnessed, some type of a story was created that held the astronomic events in it. Judges 15 was witnessed. The Canaanites at that point created a story at that point to document the events. Then the late Bronze Age collapse occurred, and the Canaanite or Israelite Egyptian confluence occurred, and the priests continued watching it, but it must not have been documented as well. It just documented the major theses, major points of each of the conjunctions at that point. And then when the Israelites, when the United Monarchy started to come into existence, the king, probably David, I believe it makes most sense, because David dated to about 980 to 960 BC, and that was before Solomon, although the things in the Bible saying Solomon was all wise and knew everything about the stars and everything indicate to me it could have been Solomon more likely, but I don't know. But that king was looking to establish his kingdom on the best terms possible. What do you do when you're trying to establish yourself on the best terms possible? Try to figure out which God to pray to at that point, because at that point it was natural to try to figure out who's the most powerful, who should we be appeasing. That king evidently made it so that they created the Judges 16 at that point, and went back and changed the protagonists of Judges 14 and 15 to being the Philistines. because the Philistines didn't really come into power until about 1200 BC in Israel. Does that answer the question?
Good enough, I guess. Prior to Heinrich Schliemann, the Trojan Wars and all of the characters around that were all considered to be mythology. Have you completely ruled out in your mind that there could have been an actual Samson whose events of life seemed to track the stars?
One thing that indicates it's not a true story, well, first off, Samson's events are in such grandiose terms. That's the first indication it's not mirroring a real person.
You mean like the Trojan War?
I'm not saying the Trojan War is not false. the Samson's, what?
So Samson could not be like Hercules.
Samson was, okay, the Philistines were coming from Greece and the surrounding area at that point. There was a huge interaction between the Canaanites, Israelites, and the Philistines. That, I believe, that included their mythical concepts. And I believe that Samson and Hercules, the myths themselves, influenced each other. I believe Hercules is the Greek portrayal of Mars, and Samson was the Canaanite portrayal of Mars.
Okay, so we're going back to mythology.
For this story, for that, yes.
Okay, so Heinrich Schliemann, that didn't happen?
I'm not very familiar with Heinrich
He
Schliemann.
was the archaeologist who uncovered the city of Troy.
And how does,
From the mythological accounts, he was able to uncover, basically start the dig there.
okay, out of all of, we've done a lot, okay, one quick answer on that is there's been a lot of archaeology done in the Canaanite towns and the Philistines towns of that area. There have been no signs of a Samson figure left other than the one ring that was in the house of the sun, which was a priestly place. There is a 100 AD source saying that Samson's shoulders were 60 cubits wide, which portrays Samson in vastly mythological framework, which links him directly to 60, which indicates if it was in the Babylonian Talmud, which stated that. So where do you draw the line for which Samson part do you investigate? Because if you take the Talmud as being quotation or quote, then you have to accept that this guy is huge.
Well, that, John? Okay. That brings up another interesting question, is the accounts of Samson, you said they occur in several different places. Is that in the Torah, in the five books, or is that in the Talmud, the anecdotal writings?
I have not studied the Torah, so all I can say is that I believe Samson is in it. I don't know that it's the same stories or anything because I've never studied it. The only other place I've known is the Babylonian Talmud, where that 60 quote came from about 100 AD.
Okay, and that, what were the dates of the Babylonian captivity, do you recall?
The Babylonian captivity was about 680 BC.
Okay. It lasted how long?
I want to say 20 years, but I'm not sure.
What best clued you in that there might be an astronomical tie-in to the events of the Bible? what triggered that thought?
The curiosity was my main impetus. The book that I read, if you look it up online, it's called Hamlet's Mill, and it was by Giorgio di Santillana and Hertha von der Schend. If you read the Amazon reviews, you'll find that it was in a pretty bad state. And I agree with that statement because they did not understand what they were talking about. They were saying that our ancestors had a new age, they understood the heavens 6,000 years ago and the knowledge has been lost. They understood a bunch of stuff that it was basically new age mumbo jumbo. But if you read that book, you will see with this, now that if you go back and read that book after you see this, you'll start to understand how the picture fits together. They have enough references and enough finger pointing saying this seems to be mythological, this seems to be astronomical, this seems to be astronomical, this seems to be astronomical. The book is mind-blowing in that term. They point out, I forget which city it is, where they have statues lined up in astronomical positions. It seems like a whole bunch of astronomical thinking was occurring back then. And that book itself was the answer to your question. It was so mind-blowing, it was like, could it actually possibly be true?
Right. So, just a second question. Are there any other events in the Bible? You said, well, the whole Samson story is really, in the Bible, tied to astronomical events. Back then, are there any other events in the Bible that have the same connection?
The only other story that I have an inkling might have started from that type of thinking was Jonah and the whale. But other than that, I'm unaware of any astronomical stories in the Bible.
Plato speaks about the great catastrophe that caused the demise of Atlantis, and I believe he estimated that was 10,000 years before his time. So that puts that about, I guess, nearly 12,000 years from now.
Yeah.
So you're saying the New Age account was not reliable in any sense about worldwide catastrophes. Is that?
No, as far as I've not found haven't found any evidence that our ancestors had any real deep astronomical knowledge. The Samson story is, as far as I can tell, is the oldest real astronomy story we have. Although I take that back, I do believe the Hercules story is probably tied to celestial events. But to unravel the Hercules story, you actually have to go back and figure out which version of the Hercules story came about at what time. Because from what I've seen, there's been several different versions of the Hercules story.
Okay, well this can get rather messy, but the Sumerian texts, the Sumerian tablets, are you saying that none of the characters and events there were not?
Oh no, those were
allegory?
There may be stuff now that the Samson story may give us a new insight into some of those stories. I'm not arguing that. We just don't know what they mean because we have turned our back on it for so long.
Yes, so in the Bible, I mean, there are endless wars going on between Babylonians and the Hittites and so on. So, is any of that potentially could be construed to be like one astronomical, actually
It could be. So it'd have to.
coming together, because if you read the Bible, it's nothing but wars and stuff like that. Actually, the Bible says there's a lot of begatting of wars going on. So.
I'm interested in You mentioned some of the writings about Nibiru and so forth that I'd like to find out who you found as not being credible. I have my own list of that, and I'd like to compare lists and see.
Well, the main Nibiru stuff, I forget, there was some female, I forget her name, there's only two Nibiru so-called scholars who influenced it to the point where it became so new agey and full of crap, in my opinion. And one of them was Sitchin, Zechariah Sitchin,
Oh, yeah.
and the other one was the lady, I forget, she believed,
D.M. Murdoch, Acharya S.
Acharya,
Acharya S.
she's the new one. The Murdoch, I think, was the one right before Sitchin.
Actually, Murdoch is Acharya S. Or was.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah, she
That's
passed away for a couple of years.
It's somebody else. There's somebody before. There was some lady before Sitchin who said that aliens spoke to her and told her that Nibiru was coming, that it was a cataclysm.
That could have been any number of a dozen channels out there, actually, probably.
Wow.
That one, at least on my list.
Yeah.
I do mention Nibiru in one chapter of the book, and I talk about those two people.
Any authors? Well, one last question, I suppose. So, of course, the Greeks, I mean, they had the numerous gods which tied to, astronomical things. Have those been dated? If you look at that.
The Greeks.
The Greeks, yeah, the Greek gods.
Like I said, I believe Hercules was tied to it. Aphrodite was their version of Venus,
Right.
I believe. Or I can't keep them all straight. There's so many. Astarte, Aphrodite.
But what I'm saying is that these are all tied to stories, actually. So, so what you're saying is, as one constellation moves, conjoins with another, then they tie that to a story. So perhaps a lot of these Greek stories are tied to astronomical events.
Well, I'll tell you, if you're triggering one thing for me that you might be interested in. One of our myths that you're probably all familiar with is Capricorn. As far as I can tell, Capricorn is our oldest astronomical observation. What happened is about 3500 BC, in the midwinter, the shortest day of the year, Capricorn was rising before the sunrise. And Capricorn was all the way above the sunrise before the sun disappeared out of the sky. By about 3000 BC, on the same day of the year, the shortest day of the year, Capricorn is only visible halfway because of the precession of the equinoxes. That is our very first story that actually was an astronomical observation, as far as I can tell, because they said that the god Pan dropped himself into a river to escape Typhon, the monster. And it was everything makes sense as it being the very, very first observation of the precession of the equinoxes on the winter solstice.
Oh, okay. Well, it actually makes sense to, well, anyway, so I think much of this makes sense, actually, because people treated the gods as being up there and having, so. Any more questions? Okay, now's the time for you to say a few words, if you wish, folks. And then you can sit down and the others will say a few words. First one?
I find this kind of thing fascinating. The Prophecy Club, which is based in Plano, had a speaker come in, and I think she was able to make astronomical correlations to everything throughout the book of Revelation. And I just looked up Revelation and the Stars. There's somebody else that's written a book about Revelation and the Stars. And I don't know that much about it, but I think it's quite interesting that you can take stories in the Bible and find astronomical correlations to these things, which I just find fascinating. But you know, it's one of those things, one of those rabbit trails that you could probably spend the rest of your life pursuing if you wanted to. But I don't know, I just want to say that I just think it's just really interesting that you can find those kinds of correlations in a Bible story like Samson, where you can actually make some correlations that seem to make some sense. So I don't know, I just wanted to throw that out there. I guess it's just kind of interesting.
I will plug it. If anybody's
So
interested.
make sure you advertise your book before everything's ever over and done. Well, some years ago, some of my friends who make electric water in Colorado got me on a journey to West Virginia to meet someone I would describe as a frustrated Lutheran who had read the Bible through cover to cover 50 times, and he came up with a system called the Infinity Bible Code, which went based on Hebrew values of numbers, and especially in the Old Testament. Most of the Bible codes only work in the Old Testament. He had a method that worked all the way through the New Testament and wrapped around again. That's why he called it Infinity. And what it basically came to is you could take the numerological number of some verse, and you could find words in Hebrew that matched that, and then you could trace that numerology through the Bible and learn more about the same subject. And it all would be telling the same thing. My spiritual journey, actually, I blew off Christianity because I was the son of a minister, and that was pretty easy to do since he wasn't really all that devout himself. But I traveled to India, so I'm giving you kind of the East Indian view of things here. I guess their culture, they are now revising their estimates, and they're going back through their scripture and their movements, I think through Srijan Foundation, where they have traced their important documents back to 14,000 BC. And the problem was that Max Muller, one of the foremost Oriental scholars of the time, believed that the world was only 6,000 years old. So he dated all of the scriptures, the Indian scriptures, to about, I think he gave them about 1100 to 1600 BC or something was the range he placed everything in. See, I actually ascribe to a different model, and I ascribe to a model which has been popularized under the idea of the yugas or ages, and not the Hare Krishnas or Hare Critters version of it, that if you all know what I'm talking about. But according to their scriptures, we started coming out of a lower age, what they call the Kali Yuga, in about 1600, 1700. And the very signs that are described in their religious writings of how we would know these things were taking place did occur. We had discovery of electricity and magnetism, and then, by the time we get to the 1900s, we're beginning, halfway through the 20th century, we're getting into biomagnetism. We understand etheric things, and so we have this unfolding into what they call the Dwapara Yuga, or kind of the age beyond the Kali. Now, Kali is actually the name. When you're talking about symbolism and metaphor and things of this sort, one of the main Hindu goddesses, the consort of Shiva the Destroyer, her name is Kali. Kali is the feminine form of the word Kala. which is the word for time. Time destroys all things. That's a real wicked goddess. You want her to treat you kindly. You want time to deal with you kindly, don't we all, folks? Okay? So the entire Hindu pantheon is based upon some very symbolic understandings when you get down to just a little bit deeper level. And I still remember one program I was at, one Hindu program, where a fifth grader got up and he said, look y'all, every Hindu believes in only one God. We just believe that that one God appears in different forms once in a while. So, I mean, you have to kind of look at that. Now, when I was talking about the Srijung Foundation and the Yugas, they actually have astronomical charts from their scriptures going back thousands and thousands of years. And so I know it's a hard pill to swallow, but the West really had a bad time coming out of the Dark Ages. There was a lot of wisdom elsewhere in the world. I would bring you back to about 10,000 BC. We had a major catastrophe back then. Most of, this is where I go for the conspiratorial view of history. If you read the standard explanation of things, I don't think you're going to get anywhere near what really went on. I had a geologist break down. This is a petroleum geologist. I think he knows his stuff because people pay for his services to go find oil. He broke down and he said, you know, the Grand Canyon's only 8,000 years old. Well, he didn't mean a 6,000-year-old Earth. What he meant is we had a major catastrophic event which caused an ice age about 12,000 years ago. We literally went from higher technologies back to Stone Age, and literally the survival of a very few at a very primitive level. Those societies, if you look in the Mesopotamian world, in the Middle East, they have found vast underground labyrinths that some of these older cultures had. Well, that would be somewhere where you might be able to preserve something from a previous culture, where you might have a clue. But it's kind of like, okay, getting back up to speed. I don't presume that the technology they had back then is the technology we have today. It might be similar. I don't believe they had exactly our computer science to, you know, give analogy. I don't think it really, the evidence is not there. But I mean, I look at the pyramids and I'm like, we can't even do that today. We don't have the cranes, we don't have the technology. We have roads that dropped like 1,000 feet. You'll be going along a shore and have an ancient road that comes right up to a cliff. Down hundreds of feet underwater, the road continues. And we have all kinds of ancient, you know, civilization programs now. David Hatcher Childress, and so forth. Anyway, okay, that's beyond my 5 minutes.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm Wendy, and I am David's sister. And I think that David needs to write another book because he calls his book Religious Cult Survivor Discoveries of Religion, and he starts the first chapter with stuff that he barely mentioned. We were actually kidnapped into a religious cult. We were actually tortured there.
Wow.
They dressed up as demons and chased us around and told us that we needed to believe that they were the only true church. And so the religious discoveries I think is interesting, even though I'm not into the stars and it's all over my head. But I did love the first chapter of his book. If you read his book, the first chapter he goes very little into. One day our mom came and kidnapped us and took us to Idaho, where we were for 6 or 9 months. Both of us don't know. We disagree on stuff. But they actually tortured us there, and they tortured our siblings, and we got to watch people get tortured. So I think that he's a very good writer, really great. He does this first chapter of the book, and I've read the book, But I think he needs to do another book and actually expand and actually talk about what it was like to see our relatives and our family members actually do this mind manipulation, control, propaganda, where we were torn between two of our parents, and literally every other weekend we were told we weren't supposed to be indoctrinated into this only true Catholic church, which they were the only 2,000 true Catholics. All the other Catholics were going to hell. So I really think it would be interesting if my brother would, because he's a really good writer, he really develops the characters in the first chapter and talks about how my mom was feeling this way and we were feeling this way, and all of a sudden this happened and that happened. And I think that he's a great writer and that he needs to write a book about this stuff. But sometimes I wonder why, I don't know, this is not a question time, but he only wrote like 4 or 5 or 6 pages about this stuff, which was traumatic, and we actually won a $1.17 million lawsuit settlement, which we never collected and was overturned, and we all got maybe $10,000, $60,000 a piece or something, which there were 5 of us kids and my dad. So we took this money and I went to college, and I don't know what he did with his. I think he loaned it to my cousin to buy a house because he's a very sweet guy. Well, anyway, he's a sweet guy, and that is something he would have done. He's very nice. He's always nice to anybody who's helpless, he always helps. And I think that part of this experience of being tortured as a child has had a major effect on every member of my family. And I think that like our aunt was a nun. All of our 3 aunts were nuns in this thing. And one of them said she wanted to learn to cook. And they punished her because she wanted to learn to cook, and they said, you obviously want to escape from the cult. So you're in the kitchen, and now you're gonna lay face down, or I don't know if it's face down or face up. And they walked over her for 12 hours and said, that will teach you never to want to leave the cult. So I feel like there's a huge aspect of my brother, he's a great writer, and he's gone all the way off on this stuff that I don't understand. And maybe you all understand it, you all seem a lot smarter than me. But I would really love to see a book about this stuff that was so traumatic and so more than 5 pages. Because literally, it was event after event of being starved, being told you couldn't have a jacket if you wouldn't say, being frozen, being left here and left there. And to me, I felt like, here's a book that's got 6 pages or 9 pages about this is what happened that splurged me into my religious discoveries, and now it's all about the stars. But I think my brother has a huge amount of depth and a huge amount of stuff that I think he should do a second book. That's what I think.
Thank you.
Love you.
Thanks, Beth.
His book is called, what's your book called, David?
Laughing at the Devil, One Man's Religious Discoveries.
I want to say something about that, okay? Sorry. Okay, it's called Laughing at the Devil. I actually thought that was because they would dress up as devils and chase us.
Really?
And there's actually a video of that on Dateline, did an episode on another family that survived our cult, and they've actually got home footage of these guys dressed as demons with the Halloween costumes on, chasing the 5-year-old little kids, which is what me and my brother were like 5. So 5 and 4 and 3 and 6 years old. I had nightmares about demons chasing me until about 10 years ago. I couldn't sleep without, sometimes I'd wake up I kicked the wall one night, in my sleep, got a huge bruise on my foot. So I think a traumatic event like that has propelled him to write about the stars, which is something I don't understand anything about. I've read his book a couple times, but I really think the first 6 pages need to be put into like a 200-page book. And I do love you, and I probably shouldn't have said that at your little talk thing.
I just have a quick question. It's kind of off topic, but how did you all get rescued from this? I know your father tried to intervene, but did the
My
people
dad
help us?
slept outside of this religious cult for 2 weeks in his car, and he told me he did not even eat because he was afraid. He had to watch when my mom was taking us kids, and there was usually a religious cult priests or whatever that would follow us, or brothers or people that would be with us. He had to watch until we were not supervised, and then he came and he actually grabbed our hands, and my mom had all our hands, and he got me and he took me away, and they chased us, and we went to the police. We got in the car and went to the police station, and my dad went back with the SWAT team and got my brother and my 3 sisters, I guess, were at that time out of it.
Wow. And this was Catholic?
Yeah.
Well, some
They were the only true Catholics. They're a Trident team. They broke off from the Catholic Church at the Vatican II when something
Oh, that's right.
they were not happy
They
with
were- They wanted to say
they wanted to
Latin.
they had to pray in Latin, and
Got
the men
Got
had to
it.
sit on this side of the church, and the women had to sit on this side of the
That's right.
church. You had to wear your skirts down to your ankles. You had to cover your head. You couldn't show your elbows. You were immodest and going to hell if you showed your elbows. We would ride on a bus, and all of us kids had to look down because if we looked out the windows, we would see the worldly sinners going to hell that were showing their elbows. And
Yes.
then we had
What's the name of the group?
That sounds like.
it was called the Tridentine Latin Rites Church. Then it was called the Fatima Crusaders. It was called the Blue Army. They change their name when they get sued, so I don't know what
Right.
name.
Okay.
The name, if you looked it up, you would look under Francis Schuckart, SCHCUKARDT. He died, and there's still people on the internet saying this guy is a great pope or whatever. He was the only true pope because he broke off the Vatican II. But we were kneeling on a floor like this with a thin layer of felt for hours at a time, chanting in Latin. And I don't know about David, but I was floating out of my body on the ceiling. And then if you look like you're going to pass out or fall asleep, they'd come by and hit you with something.
Right. Oh my God. Oh, what you survived. Can I?
Oh, yes, yes, everyone is allowed.
Hello, my name is Alma, and I have known David and Wendy for about 14 years. And one thing that I grew up in a conservative Christian church, and I consider myself a Christian. I accepted Jesus when I was 12 years old. But as I get older, I think I want to say that I don't believe in religion, but I do believe in a relationship with God. And so I feel like I go to church and I never say like, I'm Baptist, I'm Methodist, I'm Lutheran, everything. But I do believe in a relationship with God. And one thing, I have heard this story. I read David's book a long time ago when it first came out. And I don't understand it also. I don't know. I know a lot of the stories of the Bibles. A lot of them make sense. A lot of them don't make sense. And, I just don't understand them, a lot of them. But one thing that I do understand is the love of God. And I can recognize goodness. And one thing that I know about Wendy and David is that they have a wonderful heart. And when I hear all the stories, everything that I have, that I know that they have gone through, I cannot help but see how God has protected them, and how God has been there for them, and how God continues being there for them. And I met some of the family, back north, and to see how humble this family is, and after they have gone through so much, you would think that they will be bitter, but they're not. They're very sweet, they're very kind to everybody, and I don't think they come just out of the air. I think they just come from the love that God has, His grace and mercy that He has shown to them and to all of us. And I really appreciate you opening your heart, David, and to come and explain something that, I'm like Wendy, some things I have no, and I'm a school teacher, and I teach 5th grade, and I teach all the subjects, and some of the things that I cannot give an opinion because I don't understand it. I don't have the right to say, oh yeah, you're right or wrong, but it makes sense to you, and maybe it's something that I need to read more about it. But one thing that I do understand is that God loves you.
Amen.
Okay, and that religion might tell us something, but the relationship with God, because I have lived it, I have gone through, you know what I have gone through, and He has not left. And no matter what we go through, He loves us, and that's a love that you can never compare.
Amen.
And that's all I can say. Thank you.
Well, anyway, Michael, well, would anyone like to reflect on their religious experience?
That's a different
Are
subject.
you wanting somebody to go up here and talk more, or what?
Yeah, sure, why not?
I can make some more points about our childhood if you want.
Yes,
Okay,
please
that would be
do.
interesting.
Yeah, I'm curious.
So, but, yeah, once John, his
Well, this is the first time I have heard about this group. And there's Shugart?
Shukart?
Yeah.
Shuckart?
You can find them on the internet.
Shuckart. I've never heard of the group before, but I know back in 2000, April of 2005, I did a basically videotaped a conference for Mel Gibson. And guess what Mel Gibson is? He's a traditionalist. And but I didn't see, of all the 50 to 60 clergy from all over the world who attended there, this is after he did the Passion movie, I didn't see anyone there who seemed to be any kind of extremist. And in fact, they really couldn't even decide whether the Novus Ordo was okay or whether, you know, the Tridentine Mass had to be there. And I mean, I've never, well, I say I've never been a Catholic. I wasn't raised a Roman Catholic. And I eventually went the route of Eastern Orthodox. And, I mean, you know, Gibson and his group had a very interesting quandary. A lot of it, if you're familiar, maybe even this cult leader may have used the works of Hutton Gibson. I'm not sure, because Hutton wrote extensively on Catholic doctrine. He had a book out called "Is the Pope Catholic?" Were you familiar with that? Yeah. See, you experienced this as children. Yeah. Yeah, Hutton, I ate breakfast with Hutton a few times, and he was in his 90s then. I understand Mel took him down to Panama and got some treatments done, and he's recovered from Alzheimer's. So Hutton, last I knew, Hutton was still hanging in there. But Hutton wrote some doctrinal books, because something really did change in the 1958 conclave. Is that what you call it, conclave?
The Vatican of the 60s.
Yeah, it was after Pius XII died. Now, this is a non-Catholic talking to you about this. So, I mean, I don't have any dog in this hunt, especially, but I've had good friends who were Catholics. And everything changed. And to their account, there was actually a Cardinal Siri elected, and the Parisian cardinals threw a fit, and basically they said, either you elect the man we have chosen, or we are being told the Vatican will be nuked. And there's actually evidence there were nuclear tests by Russia and the United States in the 2 weeks coming up and during that conclave in '58, which is very strange. So, looking back on that, some people say that it was a Masonic takeover of the Roman Catholic Church. The big question is whether the Roman Catholic Church was wholesome prior to that. So, I mean, you know, you have that issue, but you started having Vatican II, then Paul VI came in and made it mandatory to perform the Novus Ordo, Tridentines out. Priests were furloughed off to, some small parish somewhere, Podunk, swampland or something. If you were excommunicated, the entire Church of Spain for some years held out. Considering that the entire Roman Church is based on the authority of the papacy, that's kind of an unusual thing to do. But they recognized there were some doctrinal problems there with the Novus Ordo. And so all I'm really saying here is there actually was some basis for the cult leader nutcase who was torturing you all,
Right.
and putting you through that incredible programming, mind trip, and whatever. But see, you find many times irregular people gravitate to positions of power and legitimacy, and my heart goes out to you.
that in England we're basically all Church of England, Protestant church. As you know, Henry VIII wanted a divorce, and the Pope granted one, so he decided to essentially set up his own church, which was Protestant, and so on. In England, all children, there's morning assembly actually in all schools, and where we say the Lord's Prayer and sing hymns. It's every morning, and of course we have about 3 or 4 periods of religious instruction a week, and so we're all fairly well grounded in the Bible. And but when there are because we still have Catholics actually. It's quite prevalent, especially when you have people from Ireland come over, which they do, and people now from Poland. And so in England, the Catholic Church has had somewhat of a renaissance because of that. But when you look at, so I always draw a distinction between religion and Christianity, and I don't think they're in any way connected. I mean, only loosely, because religion, as you just discussed in this cult, it always tends to be violent and very punitive. And that's what you see in many religions. It's all about punishment. There's always a sin, and there's always punishment associated with that, which is really counter to the Christian message, which is about love and tolerance and so on. And so I just typically discount the basis of the religion as the Old Testament. I think the origin of Christianity didn't come from that area of the Middle East. It actually came from the very, very Far East, which is a totally different ethic and moral values. And when you look at the two together, the Old Testament and the New Testament, you can see it's totally different, totally different. And when I was a child, and I played the part of one of the 3 wise men actually. I was about 7 years old, they came from the east, okay, and they followed the star, and the business of finding a young person to be the leader of the religion it still goes on in certain religions. So that's an example, and that's what many people believe to have happened actually. And he was taken back to the Far East to be indoctrinated in the Far Eastern religion, in fact. So that's where Christianity came from. It had nothing to do with the religion that was going on in the Palestine at that time. And so that's what, and I tend to believe that because they're so disconnected. You read the two together, and there's no connection in terms of ethics and values and so on. So that's my 10 pennyworth, and I think the problem is you see many people who say they're deeply religious, but when you look at what they do, they're profoundly unchristian in their attitudes and what they do. And they're all about punishing people and so on and so forth, and there's not much compassion, there's not much love, and there's not much kindness and so on with these people. I mean, it's quite disheartening and alarming to an extent. So anyway, that does reflect itself, of course, in politics. With the evangelicals certainly on the punishment side of things and the intolerance side of things. But anyway, that's my few words on that.
One more go at it. John always gets me out of my seat.
I make you think, Steve.
You make me think. Actually, I follow the biblical research of Michael Heiser, who actually trained here at Dallas Theological Seminary many years ago. And studied ancient languages, and one of the, it's a very common statement that the Old Testament and the New Testament are a different morality, a different law, basically. Heiser brings up that basically every one of the cities that were destroyed, that were commanded the Israelites to destroy, were the cities of the giants. And I don't know if any of the giants had shoulders that were 60 cubits wide. I kind of doubt that, but if you do read the accounts, they were quite large, and we do have some large skeletons. We are the abused victims of religions, but one of the more insidious religions is the religion of scientism.
Amen.
I was traveling in the car with my father and my younger sister to, would have been, I guess, junior high. It would have been 7th grade. We were in the car going to 7th grade, so whatever year, gosh, we're back in the mid-60s there. And it was reported on the whatever National Public Radio at that time that the fully formed body of a 14-foot tall female human was found in ancient strata. And they were speculating on the program that the male could have been as much as 17 feet tall. And they basically said, the information said that, all the cranial, everything was just perfectly what we would expect of humans today. And then you're expecting to hear follow-up on that. That little short news blip was never followed up by anything but silence. Because we have the official story, there are many things in the history books today that have been disproven, known to be incorrect, but we're living with them, because we have a religion of scientism. And I go back to the 1930s, late 20s going into the 30s, and the current wizards, I'll call them the quantum physicists of today, where Michio Kaku will tell you every quantum physicist wakes up and believes 6 impossible things before breakfast. Well, how did they get there? They got there because Dirac, the mathematician, came up with an equation that postulated negative states, but it basically explained everything that waves. It was the universal wave equation. Heisenberg hit the ceiling. Schrodinger wasn't happy with it because they wanted a 3D science. They wanted to dispel all this spiritualism, all this Alice Bailey, Alina Blavatsky. They wanted it all to disappear. We're going to get rid of it. We're going to have a 3D science. All you're going to have is what our physical senses can measure and what our instruments can measure, nothing else. So that's what we're living in now.
Amen.
Anybody else? Okay, you get to, you get to say the last word and expound on a bit more on your childhood
We'll
experience.
do what,
If you want, if you want.
I'll open it up for any questions, free form.
Well, no, we're done with the question.
Yeah, we're
block.
Oh, okay. All of,
You're the closer.
You're the last word.
Make the final statement.
okay.
Wrap up the meeting.
I will, okay, one,
Respond to anything that we said that you disagree with, or especially if you
Or
disagree.
not, whatever.
Or not, whatever.
I will, since you guys were interested in my childhood story, I will tell you one thing I'm trying to come to grips with myself is how different people remember things so differently. Wendy remembers things in grandiose terms that I don't think they happened that way, but I'm not sure because I didn't live her life. In my terms, I'll tell you, it took me years to put things back together after I may cry here or something. You might get some emotion. It took years to come to grips with everything that happened because we were under intense pressure. I've told about it in the book, but we were torn. She was right. We were torn between mom and dad and the cult and my grandma. And my grandma, my mom's maternal grandma, she was a force of nature. Some of you know people like that, but Grandma Urban was a force of nature. She wanted what she wanted, she got. She was the one that went, okay, step back further. There was a Fatima Crusade. As far as I've put it together, you want me to more into the speaker? Can I take the speaker off? And
No, wherever you get a light, I just want to make sure the camera's pointed.
Okay. As far as I can tell, Schuckart split with the church in the 60s, I'm guessing, right after the Vatican II. He was not a main priest or anything. He wasn't a bishop or anything. But through the course of events, somehow he got bishopized or something by some Brown character who had the link to the Vatican, who was so sanctioned by the pre-Vatican II
Brown's
Pope.
Old Catholic Church. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So using him as a claim, then Schuckart became the last true link because he had roots going back to pre-Vatican by his hierarchy. My grandma ended up helping them. I don't know how she got involved, but she took care of a boarding house for girls there where they'd get girls runaways, I don't know, probably runaways that were tired of things and wanted to rebel against their parents for whatever reason. They'd come over and then they'd learn to become nuns and they'd get brainwashed. Well, Mom and Dad's relationship fell apart because Dad was working 7 hours or 7 days a week. He's one of those guys that believes that you always have to work. He wasn't paying attention. He had a lot of debt from earlier, so he went for work for Boeing. He was a smart man, but he didn't know how to keep a relationship going. He ignored us, and that just made her tired, wanted to go back to her childhood days where she was raised in a Catholic church with the nuns and everything. When they took us there, Wendy said that they ran away with us. And I tend to use the word term, she ran away with us. But as far as I can tell, the thing that makes most sense to me is I asked Dad about it, and he said that Mom actually told him that she was going to take us to the cult because she wanted to get away and go to her mom. And he said she was doing it for a week. And that makes sense to me because I don't remember him showing up for a week. When she didn't go back and he couldn't get a hold of her, then he started camping out right across the street. And it wasn't bad at the very beginning. He tried to get with us, but it became they said he had to join in order for everything to be okay. And it was soon a big deal. They were hiding us in the basement. Like I said, memory is a funny thing. My aunt says the one time they took us to another place to get us away from her. I don't remember going to the other place. I do remember being in the basement, washing a dog or whatever it was, with my heart thumping. Memories like that. Then we went about January 24th in 1974. And I'm pulling these back from sources. My aunt says, my aunt has a blog, she dated it this, there was a court case gives the dates about that. So I'm using all of my sources that way to try to tie this whole thing together. So it was about January 24th we went, and it was a St. Patrick's Day potluck when Wendy got back by Dad. So about 3 months. And then it was a few weeks after that when Dad got us back. And what he had to do is he had to be in Idaho for 3 months, I think it was 3 months or 60 days or whatever, to establish citizenship in Idaho so that he could get the Idaho courts to take legal action. Wendy says SWAT was involved, but Dad, in my mind, the SWAT was surrounded by cop cars because we had the flashing lights. Dad says it was just one cop car, so it tells you how memories are funny. It's just, I believe Dad's probably the right person. He said it was one cop car. They came and just got the police to get us, and then he took us to a friend's. Then after that was only 3 months, but it was the next 5 years that were miserable. My dad and mom lived as brother and sister for 2.5 years, I think Dad said, and just so Mom could be with us. And at that point, when Dad was working, Mom was praying with us, indoctrinating us. Dad, at that point, really was the son of Satan in everybody's minds on the cult side, and I literally believe that. And it makes me mad thinking of that fuckers. When they turn you against your own dad, that pisses you off. But then they got the divorce. I remember him throwing Mom out once on a concrete porch because she was trying to get us to take us back and indoctrinate us, and he actually had to physically throw her out, and she was bleeding because it was so much force on the concrete. And then it was just a friggin' nightmare. As far as Wendy's, remember in the church, them scaring us with the devil being outside, I don't remember stuff like that. I don't remember, for me, the traumatic events in the church were one day somebody didn't say something, so they hit everybody. They swatted us all with a board. They had cell meetings outside of the church so that the boys and girls would get together, boys groups and girls groups, and you'd get to know the Lord and in your own way. And one of those cell meetings, they assigned me to draw a picture of Jesus and Joseph. And the things were so crazy, I never drew the picture, and then I got swatted again for not drawing. And I got swatted in the school, not in the cell meeting, so everything was so tied up there. I know I was so scared in the church, or in the school, that I had to pee one day, and I really held it, really held it. And then I couldn't wait, and in the middle of prayers, I finally raised my hand, and they said, wait, so I peed my pants. That's the type of pressure that was under back then. It was terrible looking back at it. But
It get closed down.
it never really got closed down per se. The Dad got the $1 million verdict against him, a unanimous jury verdict, and then the judge overthrew that verdict, saying the jury didn't know what they were talking about, which makes no sense. And so I've seen that our justice system really isn't justice.
Oh, no, it isn't. No, it isn't.
But anyway, Dad, each of us got $10,000, and my $10,000, I bought my first computer. So that was
You got something.
I got something from it.
Do you not remember them shaving the people's hair if they would mention sex? They would shave these girls' hair bald.
I don't remember that. I remember the girls being shaved. I remember the shaved people, but I don't remember what it was for. But, so what else would I have meaning to say? Oh, the funny thing about memory, I remember one of the most traumatic events in my childhood was probably after Dad had thrown Mom out and finalized the divorce. She came when he threw her onto the porch that day. When he was throwing her onto the porch, Wendy was on one leg and I was on the other leg. And I was probably 7 years old at that time, or eight, maybe 9. And if I could have, I would have killed him. It would have. My intent, my whole being intent, was to kill my dad. And what's so weird is that memory of wanting to kill him, completely forgotten about for years. Completely forgotten about for years. When I was in college, probably almost junior year, I had a girlfriend and I was acting aloof to her for a week, and she came down to talk about it, and all of a sudden that came up and I bawled for 45 minutes straight. Pure, just power bawling the whole time. There was no, it was, And I remembered how much the cult was pressuring me, Mom was pressuring me, Grandma was pressuring me. I hated all them fuckers. I hated all of them. But then at the same time, I still loved them because I could still understand that each of them was trying to, from their perspective, to do the best they could do. So I don't know if some people, I don't know if that's a weird realization to have, but I understood that really underneath everything, they were trying their best. As screwed up as their best was. Okay, what else do I want to say for my closing?
Where did you originally start from? You ended up in Idaho with that.
We were raised in Montana, in Kalispell, Montana, which is about 30 minutes away from Glacier Park, if you're familiar with that area. And Coeur d'Alene, Idaho is about a 4-hour drive from there.
Oh, and that's where they are.
That's where they were. Oh, on your question is how they shut down. After Dad did the court case, they did lower their pressure on their internals. They weren't as hard on their people. They shifted their position somewhat because they didn't want to go through another court case again. Then there was a fissure between Dennis Chacon and Francis Schuckart. Chacon was the wingman coming up, and Schuckart had a boy problem. I guess there's accusations that he sexually molested boys. He was also doing pills for pains that he had. They had guns involved, and Schuckart split one night, and there was gunfire, and he went to California, and then Chacon took over the group, and it's still a group. I think Chacon's dead now too, but it's still a group, and I actually have a couple sisters still in it, which blows my mind.
And what would it be called today?
I think it's still called the Fatima Crusade.
Yeah, something like
Fatima
I think-
Crusade.
There's a Wikipedia article.
Yeah.
I think it's still called
And
that.
you mentioned Blue Army. I think I've heard of that.
Blue Army was generally just a rosary thing.
Yeah. It's on the Francis Schuckart Wikipedia.
Okay.
I think it's called the Sacred Heart of Mary or something. I think they renamed it to a Mary name.
They could have.
Well, it's in Blue Flame or something.
They changed their name like 4 or 5 or 6 times. Every time they get sued, they just change the name.
Blue Army of Our Lady of Fatima.
That sounds, I mean, I think I've seen references to that. I mean, there's a lot of these strange, it's a miracle, it's something even more bizarre, like murders and something like that. But who was that Jones person?
Yes.
Yeah, Jim Jones.
So, okay. Okay. One other thing, I tried to put one chapter in there. You're talking about religion in the New Testament and the Old Testament. One thing to keep in mind when you read the New Testament is, I forget the scholar who said that the New Testament is the Old Testament prophecy historicized. He was trying to make, huh?
Revealed?
No, it's prophecy historicized. For instance, Jesus, the story of Jesus mirrors the Old Testament in as far as Jesus was a sacrificial person to get rid of all of our sins. Well, you go back to the Old Testament, and the idea of a sacrificer for eliminating sins was not a new idea with Jesus. It was actually, they had the scapegoat ritual where they'd have the goats come in and they'd dress it up and feed it, and then they'd kick it out into the desert to die and take away their sin. They also had the belief that's written in the Bible where the sins of the father were given to the kids, and kids were actually sacrificed. This is probably around 1400 BC, 1200 BC in Canaanite times. And so those sacrificial things were not brand new in the New Testament. The New Testament is actually a reaction to a lot of the Old Testament to try to put it under new guise and bring out the new feel love or whatever you want to call it. And other than that, like I said, I've tried to do my best to document it all. If you're interested, it's $21, $21.50 after tax. I'm happy to. Well, I would say I would answer more questions, but I'm supposed to close this up, and so I will close it up. Thank you all for listening.
Well, thank you for coming. It certainly was very interesting. And anyway, next week we've got Eve Ellsbury to come, and she's going to talk about what is a Fourth Amendment U.S. citizen. So that should be 14th Amendment, yes, 14th Amendment U.S. citizen. So that should be pretty interesting. Anyway, I'll conclude with the statement that a famous physicist said that bad men do bad things, but it takes religion to make a good man do bad things.